Imagine waking up every single morning not knowing if you'll live to see sunset. That wasn't dramatic thinking in early California. That was reality. That was the baseline of existence for tens of thousands of people who lived through what history books call the golden age of opportunity. But there was nothing golden about it. There was only fear. Constant, grinding, inescapable fear. Fear that the man sleeping 3 feet from you in your tent has cholera and you'll be next. Fear that the claim you're working will be stolen by someone with a gun while the law does nothing. Fear that the water you're drinking, because you have no choice but to drink it, will kill you within hours. Fear that a random argument will escalate to murder and you'll be the one bleeding out in the mud. You lived with fear the way you lived with hunger. It was always there, part of every moment, shaping every decision. You went asleep afraid. You woke up afraid. You worked afraid. You ate afraid. Fear was the constant companion of everyone trying to survive in early California. This wasn't the occasional danger that makes life exciting. This was the bone-deep certainty that violence, disease, or disaster could destroy you at any moment, and there was nothing you could do to protect yourself. No police who would help you, no medical care that could save you, no justice system that valued your life. Just you, vulnerable and exposed, in a place designed to break you. By the end of this documentary, you're going to understand exactly why fear wasn't just an emotion in early California. It was a survival mechanism. The only rational response to a world where death came fast and unpredictably, where violence was routine, where your life had almost no value to anyone except you. The people who lived through this weren't paranoid. They were paying attention. And what they saw every single day was reason to be terrified. Let me show you what it felt like to live in constant fear. We're talking about California from 1848 to roughly 1870, the gold rush era and the chaotic decades that followed. To understand why fear was constant, you need to understand what kind of place early California actually was. This wasn't a functioning society. This was barely controlled chaos. When gold was discovered in 1848, California's population exploded from about 14,000 non-native residents to over 300,000 by 1855. That's not gradual growth, that's an invasion. 300,000 people flooding into a territory with zero infrastructure, zero law enforcement, zero systems to support them. Think about what that actually means. Imagine your hometown suddenly getting 20 times more people in a single year. No new houses, no new roads, no new police, no new hospitals, just a massive surge of desperate, competing strangers with no established social order. That was California in 1849. And into this chaos came people from everywhere: the eastern United States, Mexico, Chile, China, Australia, Europe. Different languages, different customs, different expectations, all thrown together in mining camps with no rules and no authority to enforce rules even if they existed. The physical environment was hostile in ways that amplified the fear. The Sierra Nevada mountains where gold was found were brutal. Steep terrain where a wrong step meant a fatal fall. Winters that buried camps under feet of snow and killed anyone trapped without supplies. Rivers that could swell without warning and drown you. Wildlife that included grizzly bears, which were far more aggressive than modern bears and killed people regularly. The settlements that formed were temporary and lawless. Mining camps were just clusters of tents and crude shelters that appeared wherever someone found gold and disappeared when the gold ran out. No planning, no governance, just desperate people competing for resources in close quarters. San Francisco, the main city, was barely better. In 1849, it was a muddy disaster of tents and hastily built wooden structures. The city burned down 6 times between 1849 and 1851 because everything was wood and everyone used open flames. 6 times. Each fire killed people, destroyed everything, and created panic. You went asleep never knowing if you'd wake up to flames. There were no real roads between settlements. Travel meant following rough trails through dangerous country where you could be attacked by bandits, killed by Native Americans defending their land, injured by terrain, or killed by weather. Every journey was a calculated risk. Communication was nearly non-existent. If you traveled even 50 miles from where you started, you were cut off. No way to call for help. No way to get news. No way to know if danger was coming until it arrived. The isolation itself created fear because you knew that if something went wrong, you were on your own. The legal system barely existed. California became a state in 1850, but that didn't mean much in practice. There weren't enough judges, enough courts, enough law enforcement. In many places, there was no law enforcement at all, just whoever could enforce their will through strength or violence. This absence of authority meant there were no consequences for most crimes. Murder often went unpunished. Theft was routine. Assault was common. You couldn't appeal to any system for protection. You only had yourself. The economic structure created more fear. Everything was expensive because supply couldn't keep up with demand. A single meal could cost a day's wages. This meant you were always on the edge of destitution. One bad day, one injury, one robbery, one stretch without work could mean you couldn't eat. Starvation was a real possibility even if you were working. And woven through all of this was the knowledge that California was consuming lives. People died constantly. You watched people you knew get sick and die. Get injured and die. Get murdered and die. Death was so routine that you became numb to it, but the fear never faded because you knew you could be next. This was the world, chaotic, violent, deadly, unpredictable. And you had to navigate it every day knowing that a single mistake, a bit of bad luck, or just being in the wrong place at the wrong time could end you. The fear wasn't irrational. It was the only intelligent response to the reality of early California. Let's talk about what it felt like to wake up afraid and stay afraid every moment of every day. Because in early California, even the most basic aspects of survival were sources of constant fear. You opened your eyes in the morning if you managed to sleep at all, and the first thing you felt was fear about what you were breathing. You shared a tent or a cramped room with strangers. You could hear them coughing through the night. Wet, rattling coughs that meant tuberculosis. You knew TB was contagious. You knew it killed slowly and painfully. And you knew that breathing the same air as infected people meant you'd probably catch it. Every breath carried the fear of infection. Your shelter itself was a source of fear. Your tent had no lock. Anyone could enter while you slept. People were robbed regularly, sometimes killed in the process. You slept with your few possessions under your body and maybe a knife within reach. You woke up at every sound, heart pounding, wondering if someone was coming for you. Real sleep, deep, restful sleep, was almost impossible because letting your guard down completely felt suicidal. The cold in winter was terrifying. You'd wake up shivering, frost on your blanket, unable to feel your feet. You knew people froze to death in their sleep. You'd seen the bodies. You wondered every night if you'd wake up or if the cold would take you. The fear wasn't abstract, it was physical, immediate, always there. Summer brought different fear. The heat inside tents could reach 120 degrees. You'd wake up drenched in sweat, dizzy, heart racing. People died of heat stroke. You knew the signs: confusion, collapse, then death. Every summer day carried the fear that your body would simply give out under the temperature. Water created constant, gnawing fear. You had to drink. But every water source was contaminated. Rivers were used for mining, sewage, drinking, everything. You could see the filth in the water. Sometimes you could see waste floating. But you were thirsty, so you drank, and every time you brought that cup to your lips, you felt fear. Because cholera came from water, typhoid came from water, dysentery came from water, each drink was Russian roulette. The fear wasn't whether you'd get sick from the water, it was when, and which disease would you get. Cholera killed you in hours, violent, painful, horrific hours. Typhoid killed you in weeks of burning fever. Dysentery killed you through weakness and dehydration. All from water you had no choice but to drink. Food was another source of fear. Most of what you ate was preserved with massive amounts of salt to keep it from rotting. But sometimes it rotted anyway. You couldn't always tell until you were already eating. Food poisoning could kill you. Severe enough cases led to dehydration and death before you recovered. Every meal carried the fear of, is this the one that kills me? You also feared not having food. Your money, if you had any, had to be carefully rationed. Prices were insane. Going hungry was common, but you knew that malnutrition killed. You could see it happening, people getting thinner, weaker, sicker. You felt it in your own body. Every skipped meal added to the fear that your body was breaking down. The weather itself was an enemy that created constant fear. Storms could flood camps, washing away tents and drowning people. You'd hear rain start and immediately fear that the river was rising, that mudslides were coming, that your shelter would be destroyed. Lightning killed people regularly. Every storm was a threat. In summer, the fear was fire. Everything was dry. Everything was wood or canvas. Fire started easily and spread instantly. You'd see smoke and feel immediate panic. Is it coming this way? Will I lose everything? Will I burn to death? San Francisco burned 6 times in 3 years. Mining camps burned regularly. You lived with the knowledge that fire could consume you without warning. The lack of hygiene created its own fear. You couldn't stay clean. You were infested with lice and fleas. You could feel them crawling on you constantly. You knew they spread disease. Typhus came from lice. Every itch was a reminder that disease was literally living on your body and you couldn't get rid of it. You feared injuries because any injury could kill you. A small cut could become infected. Infection led to blood poisoning. Blood poisoning led to death. You watched it happen to people around you. So every time you cut yourself, every time you scraped your skin, you felt fear. Will this be the one that kills me? Living in close quarters with strangers created constant social fear. You didn't know who to trust. The man next to you might rob you, might attack you, might be insane from mercury poisoning or stress. You had to be alert constantly, watching everyone, reading situations, ready to react to threats. The fear wasn't occasional anxiety. It was the baseline of existence. You woke up afraid. You worked afraid. You ate afraid. You went to sleep afraid. Every moment of every day carried the awareness that death could come suddenly from a dozen different directions, and you had no real protection from any of them. This constant fear wore people down mentally. You saw people break under it, become paranoid, violent, or simply give up. The fear was exhausting, but you couldn't let it go because the dangers were real. So you just carried it day after day, knowing that the fear might be the only thing keeping you alert enough to survive. The fear that came from work in early California wasn't just about physical danger, though there was plenty of that. It was about knowing that your economic survival was always one disaster away from total collapse. If you were a miner, and most people were, you woke up every day fearing that today would be the day you got hurt so badly you couldn't work anymore. Because if you couldn't work, you couldn't earn. And if you couldn't earn, you starved. There was no safety net, no disability insurance, no workers' compensation, just the immediate equation: injury equals death. You stood in freezing water 12 to 16 hours a day, and you feared losing feeling in your limbs. Not because it hurt, though it did, but because you'd seen miners lose toes, feet, entire legs to frostbite. Once that happened, you were finished. No one hired a disabled miner. You'd end up begging in the streets until you died. You bent over constantly, moving rocks, sifting gravel, and you feared your back giving out. You'd watch men's backs break, watch them crumple, unable to stand straight again, watch them lose their ability to work, and then watch them slowly starve. Every twinge in your back created fear. Is this it? Is this the injury that ends me? The mercury used in gold processing created a special kind of fear. You worked with it every day. You breathed the vapors. It absorbed through your skin, and you knew what it did. You'd seen mercury poisoning, the tremors, the mental confusion, the personality changes, the slow descent into madness. You feared losing your mind, feared becoming one of the mad miners who wandered camps raving until they died. You feared the explosives. Dynamite and black powder were used to break rock, and they killed people constantly. Sometimes they detonated early while someone was setting them. You'd hear an explosion and fear that it was someone you knew, or that next time it would be you. The work demanded you handle explosives regularly, and every time you felt fear grip your chest. Mine collapses terrified everyone. You'd be underground in darkness, surrounded by rock that could fall at any moment. You'd hear creaking, feel dust falling, and you'd freeze, heart pounding, wondering if the ceiling was about to come down. When collapses happened, men were buried alive. Sometimes they were dug out quickly. Sometimes they suffocated slowly in the dark. Everyone who worked underground lived with that fear. But the economic fear was even more consuming. You feared not finding gold, because wages weren't regular. Many miners worked claims independently, and if you didn't find gold, you didn't eat. You could work all day, find nothing, and end the day poorer than you started because you'd used up your supplies. That fear of working hard and gaining nothing ate at people's souls. You feared the prices. Everything cost astronomical amounts. A single egg might cost $1, a day's wages for many workers. You feared running out of money because once you did, you had no options. You couldn't buy food, couldn't pay for shelter. You'd starve or freeze and no one would help you. Debt created crushing fear. Many miners had to borrow money to buy tools, supplies, food. The interest rates were brutal, often 10% per month. Once you were in debt, it was almost impossible to get out. You feared the debt growing faster than you could earn, feared the day when creditors would take everything you had, feared becoming so indebted you were essentially enslaved to whoever held your loans. You feared being cheated. Employers and merchants cheated constantly. They'd short your wages, overcharge for supplies, claim you owed them money you didn't actually owe, and you had no recourse. No court would help a poor laborer against a wealthy merchant. So you lived with the fear of being robbed legally, watching your earnings stolen through fraud with no way to fight back. Chinese workers faced even more specific economic fear. You were paid half what white workers earned for the same work. You feared that the already low wages would drop further. Feared that discriminatory taxes, which targeted Chinese and Mexican miners specifically, would take what little you had. Feared that white workers would organize to drive you out entirely, leaving you with no way to earn anything. Everyone feared being replaced. Labor was abundant. Workers were disposable. If you complained about conditions, you were fired. If you got injured, you were fired. If you slowed down from exhaustion or age, you were fired. You lived with the constant fear that you could be discarded at any moment and someone younger and stronger would take your place while you starved. The fear extended to your tools and possessions. Everything you owned was essential for work. Your pickaxe, your pan, your shovel, these weren't just possessions, they were your ability to earn. You feared them being stolen, feared them breaking and not being able to afford replacements. Every tool represented survival, and losing one could mean the difference between eating and starving. You feared the boom and bust nature of mining. A productive claim could go dry without warning. When it did, miners were dismissed immediately. You'd have worked today and nothing tomorrow. The unpredictability created constant anxiety. You could never feel secure. Could never plan beyond the next day because you didn't know if work would exist. Women who worked feared different but equally intense economic threats. Domestic workers feared being assaulted by employers, which happened constantly, because resisting meant being fired and then starving. Prostitutes feared clients who refused to pay or who were violent or who spread disease. Every transaction carried the fear of violence, exploitation, or death. The economic fear wasn't about wanting luxury. It was about knowing that you were always one misfortune away from destitution and death. One injury, one robbery, one stretch without work. That's all it took. And you watched it happen to people around you constantly, which meant you knew it could happen to you. You went to work every day afraid that today would be the day everything fell apart. And that fear never left because the dangers were real and constant. The fear itself became exhausting, but you couldn't let it go because letting your guard down meant missing the warning signs of economic collapse. Fear of disease in early California wasn't abstract, it was immediate and personal. You watched people die regularly and you knew with absolute certainty that you could be next. Cholera created terror unlike anything else. The disease appeared suddenly in camps and towns. One day everything was normal. The next day people were dying. You'd see someone in the morning who looked fine, By afternoon, they'd be cramping and vomiting. By evening, they'd be dead, body hollow and dehydrated, eyes sunken, skin gray. The fear came from how fast it killed and how easily it spread. You knew it came from contaminated water, but all water was contaminated. You had to drink. So every time cholera appeared in a camp, you felt crushing fear with every sip of water. Every stomach cramp made your heart race. Is this it? Is this cholera? Am I about to die? And once someone in your tent or boarding house got cholera, the fear became overwhelming. Because you'd breathed the same air, touched the same surfaces, drunk from the same barrel. You waited terrified for symptoms to appear. Sometimes they did. Sometimes you got lucky. But the fear was constant and paralyzing. Typhoid created a different fear, slower but equally certain. You'd watch people develop fevers that burned them from the inside. Watch them become delirious, wasting away over weeks. The fear was knowing that if you caught it, you'd suffer for a long time before death, that you'd be conscious through most of it, aware you were dying, unable to do anything about it. Dysentery was so common it was almost expected. But common didn't mean less frightening. You feared the dehydration, the weakness, the possibility that a mild case would suddenly turn severe and kill you. You'd seen people go from functional to dead in days from dysentery. It was one of the most routine ways to die, and that routineness somehow made it more frightening, not less. Tuberculosis created long-term dread. You heard the coughing constantly in your tent, in boarding houses, in the streets. You knew TB was contagious, knew it killed slowly. And you knew that catching it meant months of suffering, coughing blood, losing weight, suffocating gradually as your lungs failed. The fear was that you'd already been exposed, that the disease was already inside you, just waiting to show symptoms. Scurvy might sound less scary than other diseases, but watching it happen created real fear. You'd see people's gums start bleeding, see their teeth loosen and fall out, see old wounds reopen, see them develop sores that wouldn't heal. And you knew you were probably developing it too because no one could afford the fresh food that prevented it. The fear was watching your own body break down from malnutrition and knowing it would only get worse. Injuries created immediate visceral fear. Any cut, any scrape, any break in the skin was potentially fatal because of infection. You'd seen it happen so many times. Someone would cut their hand, it would look minor. Then red streaks would appear running up their arm. Blood poisoning, fever, delirium, death, all from a small cut. You feared infections because there was nothing anyone could do. No antibiotics, no effective treatment. If the infection took hold, you died. Simple as that. So every time you injured yourself, which was constant given the work, you felt fear. You'd wash the wound as best you could with contaminated water and pray it didn't get infected. You feared broken bones because they often meant death even if the break itself wasn't fatal. A broken leg meant you couldn't work, couldn't earn, couldn't eat. And if the bone didn't set properly, which was common with no real medical care, you'd be disabled permanently. Either way, the break was often a death sentence, just slower than cholera. The medical care itself created fear. Doctors in mining camps were often frauds with no training. They'd prescribe treatments that made things worse. Mercury for everything, which poisoned you, bleeding that weakened you, surgery in filthy conditions that guaranteed infection. You feared getting hurt badly enough that you'd need a doctor because the doctor might kill you faster than the injury would. Amputations were horrifying. You knew they were done without anesthesia. You'd be conscious and screaming while they sawed off your limb. You'd heard the screams. They were sounds you couldn't forget. The fear was that if you were injured badly enough, this would happen to you. That you'd experience that unimaginable pain and then probably die of infection anyway. Childbirth created terror for women. Maternal mortality rates were staggering. Women died during childbirth regularly from hemorrhage, infection, or exhaustion. Every pregnant woman lived with the fear that pregnancy would kill her. And if the birth didn't kill you, the complications afterward might. Infections were common. Treatment was non-existent. You feared dental problems because they couldn't be treated. Toothaches became abscesses. Abscesses became infections that spread to your jaw and bloodstream. People died from tooth infections. So every toothache created fear that it might be the one that killed you. Death was so routine that fear of it became almost numbing. You'd wake up and someone who'd been sleeping nearby was dead. You'd step over bodies in the streets. You'd watch people die in front of you and just keep walking because stopping wouldn't change anything. The fear wasn't that death would happen, it was inevitable. The fear was about how and when it would come for you. You feared dying alone and unmourned. So many people died with no one to remember them, buried in unmarked graves. No family to notify, just gone as if they'd never existed. The fear of not just dying, but of dying in a way that erased you completely, that kept people up at night. The constant proximity to disease and death created a kind of background terror that never fully went away. You might become numb to seeing corpses, but you never became numb to the fear of becoming one. Every cough, every pain, every symptom made you wonder, is this the beginning of the end? The fear of violence in early California wasn't about possibility, it was about inevitability. You knew that violence would happen to you or near you. The only question was when and how bad it would be. Murder was shockingly common. In San Francisco in the early 1850s, multiple people were killed every single day. That's not an exaggeration. Every morning brought new bodies. Mining camps saw murders regularly. You'd go to sleep and wake up to find someone had been killed during the night. The fear wasn't whether violence would happen, it was whether you'd be the victim or just the witness. You feared arguments escalating suddenly. Disputes over mining claims, over gambling debts, over imagined insults. These turned deadly without warning. Someone would make a comment. Tempers would flare. Guns would appear. Someone would be dead. You watched it happen so often you learned to be extremely careful about what you said and who you said it to. Every conversation carried the risk of triggering someone unstable. The fear was amplified by the fact that almost everyone was armed. Men carried pistols, knives, rifles. You had to assume every person you encountered could kill you instantly if provoked. This created constant tension. You watched people's hands, watched their eyes, looked for signs of aggression. The vigilance was exhausting but necessary. You feared theft constantly because you had so little and losing any of it could mean death. Your tools, your food, your blanket, these weren't luxuries, they were survival equipment. You knew they'd be stolen if you let your guard down. So you slept lightly, you kept everything close, you trusted no one, and still things were stolen. The fear was that you'd lose something you needed to survive and have no way to replace it. Robbery was frequent and often violent. Thieves didn't just take your possessions, they'd beat or kill you in the process. You feared being targeted because you had no protection. If someone wanted what you had and was willing to use violence to take it, there was nothing you could do. The law wouldn't help. You were simply at the mercy of anyone stronger or more violent than you. You feared nighttime most of all. Darkness brought out the worst. Sounds of fighting, screams, gunshots, these were routine. You'd lie in your tent trying to sleep while hearing violence happening nearby, sometimes very close. You'd wonder if it was coming for you next. Should you run? Should you hide? Should you prepare to fight? The uncertainty was terrifying. The complete absence of effective law enforcement created bottomless fear. There were no police in most mining camps. In towns that had sheriffs, they were often corrupt or overwhelmed. You couldn't call for help because there was no help to call. If violence came for you, you were on your own. That knowledge sat in your stomach like ice. Vigilante justice created its own terror. Communities would form mobs to capture and execute suspected criminals. These weren't careful legal processes. These were lynch mobs operating on rumor and anger. The fear was that you could be accused of something, whether you did it or not, and hanged within hours with no trial, no evidence, no chance to defend yourself. And vigilantes weren't always hunting actual criminals. Sometimes they targeted people they didn't like, people who were different, people who competed with them economically. The unpredictability of vigilante violence meant no one was truly safe. You could follow every rule and still end up at the end of a rope because a mob decided you were convenient to blame. Racial violence created specific and intense fears for non-white residents. If you were Chinese, You feared white mobs that attacked Chinese camps regularly. You'd hear about raids, workers beaten, buildings burned, people killed. You lived knowing that mob violence could come at any time and the law would do nothing. Often the law would participate. If you were Native American, you feared organized hunting parties. White militias were paid bounties for native scalps. Your life had a literal price on it. You feared being shot on sight, feared your family being massacred, feared the complete lack of any protection or justice. The terror of genocidal violence was constant and justified. If you were Mexican, you feared being driven from your property through violence and having no legal recourse. You feared being targeted by vigilantes who blamed you for crime regardless of evidence. You feared discrimination that could turn violent without warning. Women lived in constant fear of sexual violence. In a population that was 90% male, women were targeted relentlessly. You feared assault, feared rape, feared that reporting it would accomplish nothing except making you a target for more violence. The fear shaped every decision, where you went, when you went, who you trusted. And still violence happened because you couldn't avoid it entirely. You feared workplace violence from bosses and foremen who beat workers. You feared that complaining about conditions would result in being physically attacked. You feared that trying to organize with other workers would get you killed. Violence was used to enforce compliance, and everyone knew it. You feared random violence from people who'd been driven insane by mercury poisoning, by stress, by trauma. You'd see men whose minds had broken wandering camps, unpredictable and dangerous. Sometimes they'd attack people without warning. You had to watch everyone, trying to identify who might be unstable before they became violent. The fear of violence never stopped. Even in moments of calm, you knew violence was coming. You'd seen too much, survived too many close calls, watched too many people die suddenly. You lived in a constant state of alertness, always scanning for threats, always ready to run or fight. The hypervigilance itself was a form of torture. You went asleep afraid that violence would come during the night. You woke up afraid that today would be the day someone targeted you. You worked afraid that an argument would escalate. You walked afraid that you'd encounter someone dangerous. The fear was constant, reasonable, and exhausting. And what made it truly unbearable was knowing that your fear meant nothing to anyone with power. The people who could have made California safer, who could have established real law enforcement, real justice, real consequences for violence, chose not to. Your fear, your vulnerability, your danger, these were acceptable to them. You were disposable. That knowledge, that your safety didn't matter to anyone except you, was perhaps the most frightening thing of all. The fear experienced by women, children, and immigrants in early California went beyond the general terror everyone felt. These groups faced specific, targeted dangers that made every day a gauntlet of potential horrors. Women lived with the constant fear of sexual violence. In a society that was overwhelmingly male, women were seen as scarce resources to be claimed or taken. If you were a woman, you feared walking alone, feared being in rooms with men you didn't know well, feared situations where you were outnumbered and vulnerable, which was almost every situation. The fear wasn't paranoid. Assault was common, rape was common, and reporting it accomplished almost nothing. You feared going to authorities because they'd likely blame you, ask what you were wearing, ask why you were in that place, suggest you invited the attack. The legal system offered no protection, which meant you lived in constant vulnerability. Married women feared their own husbands. Domestic violence was considered a private matter. If your husband beat you, there was nowhere to go, no shelter, no legal protection. You feared angering him because anger could mean violence. You feared leaving because leaving meant destitution. You were trapped in fear, and everyone knew it, and no one would help. Women feared pregnancy because it could kill you. Every pregnancy carried the fear of dying during childbirth. Maternal mortality was so high that pregnancy was essentially gambling with your life. And you often had no control over whether you got pregnant. Your husband's desires mattered. Yours didn't. Women who weren't married or widowed feared having no economic options except prostitution. and sex workers lived in constant terror. You feared violent clients who beat or killed prostitutes regularly. Feared disease that was universal and fatal. Feared brothel owners who exploited you and took most of your money. Feared police who arrested you rather than protecting you. Every day was dangerous. Every client was potentially lethal. Children lived in fear that adults today would find incomprehensible. If you were a child in early California, you feared the work you were forced to do. Boys as young as 7 worked in mines where cave-ins, explosives, and equipment killed regularly. You feared dying at work, feared being injured so badly you'd be disabled, and you knew that if you died, few people would care. You were replaceable. You feared the adults who controlled you. Physical punishment was routine and brutal. Beatings for not working fast enough. Beatings for making mistakes. Beatings for no reason at all. You had no protection, no one to appeal to, just the constant fear of pain from people bigger and stronger than you. Orphans, and there were many because parents died constantly, feared being taken by adults who would exploit them. You'd be claimed by someone who wanted unpaid labor and you'd have no choice. You feared abuse, feared starvation, feared being worked until you died, and no one would intervene because children had no rights. Children feared disease differently than adults because you didn't understand what was happening. You just knew people around you were dying, that you might be next. That sickness came without warning and often killed. The fear was confused and total, a generalized terror of the world itself. Chinese immigrants lived in fear that was systematic and deliberate. You feared white workers who blamed you for low wages and attacked Chinese camps. You'd hear about raids, camps burned, workers beaten and killed. You feared that your camp would be next, that your family would be targeted, that you'd die simply for being Chinese. You feared discriminatory laws designed to target you specifically. The foreign miners' tax took huge portions of your income. You feared tax collectors who could seize your property if you couldn't pay. Feared that the law itself was weaponized against you with the goal of driving you out or destroying you economically. You feared being blamed for crimes you didn't commit. When something was stolen or someone was killed, Chinese residents were often accused regardless of evidence. You feared being arrested, feared being executed by vigilantes, feared having no defense because the system assumed you were guilty. Chinese workers feared workplace danger that was deliberately amplified for you. You were given the most dangerous jobs, the ones white workers refused. Building railroads, you'd be lowered down cliff faces on ropes to set explosives. You'd tunnel through mountains knowing collapses were common. You feared dying at work, and you knew that if you did, your employers wouldn't care. You'd just be replaced. Mexican residents and workers feared dispossession. If you'd lived in California before U.S. annexation, you feared having your land stolen through legal manipulation or outright violence. You watched it happen to neighbors, feared it would happen to you, feared having everything your family built taken by people who had the law on their side. Mexican miners feared being driven from productive claims at gunpoint. White miners would simply decide they wanted your claim and take it through force. You feared resisting because resistance could get you killed. You feared going to authorities because they wouldn't help. You feared the injustice of working hard, finding gold, and having it stolen while everyone pretended that was normal. Native Americans lived in the most extreme fear. You feared genocidal violence that was systematic and official. State-funded militias hunted Native people. Bounties were paid for scalps, including children's. You feared that hunting parties would find your village, would kill everyone, would take scalps as proof for payment. You feared starvation from having your traditional food sources destroyed. Whites diverted water, killed game, made gathering impossible. You watched your community starve and feared you'd be next, feared your children would die in front of you from hunger. You feared seeing your family killed and being unable to protect them. You feared watching your culture destroyed deliberately, feared that even if you survived, everything that made your people who they were would be gone. The fear wasn't just of personal death, it was of cultural extinction. All these groups feared in ways that the white men who dominate historical narratives didn't. Your fear was compounded by having no power, no voice, no legal protection. You feared and knew that your fear didn't matter to anyone in authority, that the systems supposedly designed to protect people explicitly excluded you. The fear wore you down, made you cautious in ways that constricted your life, made you hypervigilant in ways that exhausted you. And through it all, you knew that the fear was rational, that the dangers were real, and that no one was coming to make you safer. If you want to understand fear at its peak, fear, so intense it broke people completely, look at San Francisco in 1856 during the reign of the Second Vigilance Committee. This was when fear became totalizing, when it consumed everything. The committee formed claiming to restore order, but what they actually created was terror. They assembled an army of thousands of members. They built a fortress headquarters. They arrested people without warrants. They held trials without due process. They executed people by hanging them in public spectacles that crowds gathered to watch. If you were in San Francisco in 1856, you lived in absolute fear. The vigilantes could target anyone. You didn't need to have committed a crime. You just needed to be accused, or be inconvenient, or be someone the committee's leaders didn't like. The fear came from the arbitrariness. You couldn't protect yourself by following rules because there were no rules beyond the committee's decisions. You couldn't appeal to authorities because the committee was the authority, backed by thousands of armed men. You feared the sound of crowds gathering because it meant someone was about to be hanged. You'd hear the drums, hear the procession, see the body hanging from the building, and you'd know that could be you, that if someone accused you, whether honestly or maliciously, you could be next. People feared speaking, feared expressing opinions, feared being seen in the wrong place or with the wrong people. The fear constricted life to the point where you barely lived at all. You just existed, trying desperately not to be noticed. The fear was amplified by knowing that the people doing this thought they were heroes. They believed they were righteous, which meant they'd feel no mercy. No doubt, they'd hang you believing it was justice. During those months, fear in San Francisco reached levels that broke people's minds. Some fled the city entirely. Others barricaded themselves in their homes. Some simply broke down mentally, unable to cope with the constant terror. The darkest aspect was that legitimate government existed. There were elected officials, courts, a legal system. But the vigilantes ignored all of it, and the officials were too afraid to stop them. Which meant you realized that even the formal structures meant to protect you were useless against mob rule. The fear during this period wasn't just about dying. It was about the complete collapse of anything resembling justice or safety. It was the realization that civilization itself was a thin pretense that could be torn away instantly, leaving only violence and terror. When the committee finally disbanded and claimed victory, nothing had actually improved. They'd killed people, terrorized everyone, and then declared the problem solved. But the fear remained because everyone who lived through it knew how quickly order could collapse, how easily terror could return, how powerless they actually were. That period revealed the truth about fear in early California. It wasn't an unfortunate side effect of frontier life. It was the actual mechanism of social control. Fear kept people compliant, kept them from organizing, kept them accepting conditions they should have rebelled against. And once you understood that your fear benefited the people in power, it became even more suffocating. You need to understand how unimaginably different your life is from theirs, how much of your sense of safety is something they never experienced. When you go to sleep tonight, you'll do it without fearing that the person sleeping near you will rob or kill you. You'll lock your door. If something goes wrong, you can call 911. Police exist whose job is actually protecting you. You don't go to sleep running through scenarios of violence and how you'd respond. They did, every night. When you drink water tomorrow, you won't fear that it will kill you. You'll turn on the tap and clean water will come out. Water that's tested, that's safe. That won't give you cholera or typhoid or dysentery. You won't even think about it because clean water is so normal you take it for granted. They feared every sip. When you go to work, you'll do it knowing there are safety regulations, OSHA standards, workers' rights. If you're injured on the job, there's workers' compensation. If your employer mistreats you, there are legal remedies. You're protected in ways you don't even consciously think about. They had none of that. Every workday was dangerous, and if you were hurt, you were simply discarded. If you get sick or injured, you can access medical care that would seem like magic to someone from 1850s California. Antibiotics cure infections that used to be death sentences. Surgery is safe and painless. Diseases that killed thousands are now prevented by vaccines or easily treated. They died from things you'd recover from in days with basic medical care. When you encounter conflict, you can appeal to legal systems, police, courts, laws that protect you regardless of your race, gender, or wealth, imperfect systems, but systems that exist and sometimes work. They had none of that if they were poor, were female, were immigrants, were not white. Their fear had no institutional remedy. The safety you feel, even in moments when you don't feel entirely safe, is radically beyond anything they experienced. Your baseline of security would have seemed like paradise to someone living in constant fear in early California. You can walk down streets without fearing random violence. You can trust that most people aren't armed and aren't about to attack you. You can drink water without calculating disease risk. You can go to sleep without terror. These simple, daily experiences of relative safety are luxuries they never had. Your life is built on foundations of security they couldn't imagine, and you should be grateful, not in an abstract way, but with genuine, deep appreciation for how much better your life is than theirs was. Living in early California meant constant fear, not occasional danger, not periodic anxiety. Constant, grinding, inescapable fear. Fear of disease from contaminated water. Fear of violence from people who faced no consequences. Fear of economic collapse from one piece of bad luck. Fear of dying suddenly and being forgotten. Fear of authorities who wouldn't protect you. Fear of mobs who might target you. Fear of weather, of fire, of starvation, of injury, of your fellow human beings. This fear shaped every decision, every moment, every relationship. You couldn't let your guard down, couldn't fully trust anyone, couldn't feel safe anywhere. The fear was exhausting, but you carried it because the alternative, ignoring real dangers, would get you killed. The people who lived through this weren't weak or paranoid. They were paying attention. They were responding rationally to a genuinely terrifying environment. Their fear was proof they understood the reality of their situation. Most history books skip over this fear entirely because it doesn't fit the narrative of courageous pioneers building a great state. But the truth is that California was built by people who were terrified, who survived despite their fear, who carried trauma that would haunt them for life. When you think about early California, don't think about opportunity and adventure. Think about the fear. The constant, rational, justified fear that made every day a battle against panic. They survived it, most of them anyway. But the cost was high, not just the deaths, but the psychological damage to those who lived. They built California while terrified, and no one ever thanked them for that particular sacrifice. If this documentary helped you understand the reality that's been sanitized from history, there are more stories like this about other states on this channel. Every state has a hidden history of suffering and fear that deserves to be told. Watch the other documentaries. Learn the truths that textbooks skip, and be grateful, deeply, genuinely grateful that you live now instead of then, because the fear they lived with daily would break most of us within weeks. We're soft compared to them. We've never had to develop their survival skills, their hypervigilance, their capacity to function while terrified. They were stronger than we'll ever need to be, and they were scared every single day. Remember them, remember their fear, and appreciate the safety they never had.